Thank you, Robert Black. We now move on to post-colonial theory applied with our speaker, Professor Alf Baird.
Thank you, Chair, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are in the process of unveiling the reality of colonial domination in the case of Scotland. The need to end this scourge through the legal right of the Scottish people to self-determination and to seek remedy for long-standing injustices. My research applies post-colonial theory to analyse Scotland's true condition. Let me begin by highlighting the undemocratic so-called union enforced on Scots by the corrupt elite in 1707 and maintained ever since. Let us remember the erasure of Scotland from that time as an international persona, the annexation of Scotland by England rebranded as United Kingdom, the subsequent military occupation of Scotland, and the Anglo-racial apartheid that followed and continues to dominate Scotland today. That earlier injustices occurred during and after the 18th century following wars of independence does not preclude the fact this colonial legacy will continue until colonialism is ended. The oppression of unlawful occupation has merely become normalised over time with historical narratives rewritten by an imperial power with a long history as violator of treaties and international law. And let us also remember that these are the same injustices recently described by UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese in regard to the situation in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. The UN criteria for classification as a non-self-governing territory is articulated in General Assembly Resolution 1541 and includes three key indicators. The territory is geographically separate from the administering power. The people of the territory are ethnically, culturally, or linguistically distinct from the dominant population of the administering power, and the territory lacks a full measure of self-government. Scotland satisfies all three indicators. Scotland is geographically separate, its borders are clear and unambiguous. Scots are culturally and linguistically distinct, albeit our traditions, our legal system and our languages have been marginalised. And Scots lack self-government. The Scottish Parliament is devolved, not sovereign, created by an act of the England as UK Parliament. It can be overruled or abolished by Westminster. Based on any reasoned analysis, the structural indicators of colonisation are self-evident in the case of Scotland. Firstly, on economic underdevelopment. Scotland is subject to extensive trade interception, whereby Scottish resources are extracted at low cost by the administrative power and external corporate interests, with most imports also routed via England at high cost. This renders the territory dependent and uncompetitive. Direct international transport links and investments in strategic seaports in Scotland are blocked and or severely restricted, ensuring international trade is limited. The primary purpose of an annexed Scotland and its resources is to serve the needs of the administrative power, which is England as UK. The territory is therefore inhibited by limited economic infrastructure, extensive trade interception, and inadequate public services. The consequences of this include zero economic growth, an artificially low GDP per capita, unemployment, poverty, inequality, poor health, plus high levels of addiction, imprisonment, and emigration, symptoms of cultural dislocation. Scotland has the lowest GDP of all nations in northwest Europe, just 40% of near neighbours Norway and Ireland, both with comparable populations to Scotland and similar or less resources. Given Scotland's enormous resources, its current GDP per capita of around $40,000 should be expected to be at least comparable or higher to Denmark, which is above $60,000. The cost of colonialism for the Scottish people and nation is therefore conservatively estimated at $200 billion per annum, if not more. This is over 3 times greater than the current block grant of $61 billion in 2024, which the devolved Scottish Government receives from Westminster. The Scottish people are also made subject to the highest energy costs in the world. This is despite Scotland producing enormous energy surpluses, which are exported mainly to England by external corporate interests, with no royalties returned to Scotland. Scotland is permitted a narrow industrial concentration and limited manufacturing, making the economy highly sensitive to shocks. A feudal land legacy and the most concentrated land ownership in Europe favour external private interest and speculation by offshore private equity. This inhibits usage and development of large tracts of land in the interests of the people and nation. Development in Scotland is thus dictated and determined by the needs and priorities of the mother country, England as UK, and external corporate interests, whose profits are not taxed in Scotland. Here we are reminded that economic plunder is the main purpose of colonialism, which serves only to widen inequality. Turning now to the issue of cultural marginalisation. Cultural imperialism promotes the culture and language of one dominant nation in another. This enforces an alien cultural hegemony on a subordinate people, which is Anglo-centric in the case of Scots. Cultural assimilation involves an Anglophone elite culture imposed on Scots, as was the case in other British colonies. Meritocratic elites tend to be recruited primarily from the mother country, England as UK, supported by native elites who assimilate into the Anglo culture. And here we are reminded that colonialism is always a cooperative venture with native elites. Peoples in self-determination conflict are invariably linguistically divided, and the Scots are no different. Language and culture intersect to form our identity and give us our national consciousness. The aim of linguistic imperialism is to marginalise and destroy indigenous language, also referred to as linguistic genocide or linguicide. Loss of language undermines a people's sense of identity and belonging. And colonialism aims to destroy native language, in our case the Scots and Gaelic languages. Scots are deprived still of learning their own Scots language, which results in only 1/3 of the people able to speak it today. This is achieved through a process of cultural colonialism where the language of state education, English, is not the language of the culture of the oppressed group. The entire bureaucracy in a colonial society hears and uses only the colonizer's language, which is the only language that opens the door of opportunity. The inevitable outcome of linguistic imperialism and marginalisation of the native tongue is socio-linguistic prejudice, segregation or apartheid, and subordination of native speakers and culture. Culture and identity are very closely connected, and post-colonial theory views national independence as a fight for a national culture and desire for nationhood as a cultural emotion. Like many colonised peoples, the Scots were sold the idea of a British or English identity. However, as many former colonies, now United Nations member states, discovered, this manufactured identity, which is the primary tool elites use to retain power, is a cultural illusion. Within the colonised territory, new forms of land development and imposed heritage narratives became normalised via the cultural recreation of the coloniser. Examples included land clearances with entire communities being removed and villages destroyed to be replaced by sheep. The process continues today with large highland estates used as speculative investments by external tax-avoiding interests, limiting and preventing social and economic development of the people and nation. A further colonial tool employed in the domination of Scotland is demographic manipulation. Since the 1707 annexation and following the atrocities of the 18th century wars of independence, Scotland has endured centuries of clearances, evictions, transportation of people, export of endangered labour, and empire resettlement programmes. As a consequence, Scotland today has a vastly diminished indigenous population. In post-colonial theory, this is known as banishment of natives, although ethnic cleansing is the widely held scholarly term used today. In just 60 years between 1870 and 1930, 2 million people were shipped out of Scotland, almost half its then population. In total, some 4 million Scots have departed Scotland since annexation, which is the largest loss of population in Western Europe for a country of our size. The loss of Scots was at least 8 times that of English immigration. At the point of annexation, Scotland's population was 1/4 that of England. Today it is less than 1/10. And Scotland's population remained static at 5 million for much of last century, when natural growth should have seen at least 10 million. The majority of people settling in Scotland come from one country, England. Inbound flows markedly differ from outbound, mainly comprising middle-class English people given professional and managerial jobs in Scotland. This has resulted in an ethnic and cultural division of labour, with the social hierarchy favouring the dominant Anglophone culture. In effect, much of the Scottish population has been displaced, and institutions in Scotland are made Anglo-centric. The population of Scotland has recently been growing since 2000, but this is only through accelerated in-migration, again mostly from England. Scotland today has its lowest birth rate on record. Many Scots remain unable to bring up families due to low wages, lack of economic opportunity, and a chronic shortage of housing. Existing and new housing stock has been absorbed through increased in-migration and settlement of people from England, with excessive demand from our much larger, 10 times larger populated neighbour, bidding up house prices to unaffordable levels for Scots. Essentially, the conditions have now been created which prevent Scottish births, which means the Scots as a distinct people remain firmly in the process of perishing, as is their culture. Migration is a matter reserved to Westminster and England as UK as administrative power. The long-term oppressions and manipulation of the Scottish population, including large-scale displacement and replacement of indigenous Scots, which can be considered ethnic cleansing, as well as cultural genocide, may be regarded as a continuous colonial process not yet ended. Let us also consider the essential features of dependency. Politically, every attempt to assert Scottish self-determination through democratic means, through referenda or electoral mandates, has been selectively managed, blocked, or ignored by Westminster, or deemed legally ineffective by the England as UK Supreme Court. Scotland is governed from outside. Its national identity is suppressed. Its resources are controlled without accountability, and its democratic will is subordinated to an external majority. This is precisely the pattern of dependency and domination that the United Nations has recognised in many decolonisation cases since 1945. In this situation, there is also a gross misrepresentation in that the United Kingdom has consistently portrayed Scotland as a willing partner in a democratic union, not as a colonised nation. This false narrative has prevented Scotland from being listed as a non-self-governing territory, shielding the UK from legal obligations it would otherwise incur under Article 73 of the UN Charter. And finally, in regard to psychological subjugation, domination by another culture results in a people developing a colonial mindset, which is a feeling of cultural inadequacy, including self-loathing, also related to internalized racism. Post-colonial theory tells us that colonialism is based on psychology, and with colonial oppression resulting in a mental pathology that's suffered by a colonized people. This colonial condition is viewed as a disease of the mind for which the only remedy is liberation. Independence and decolonization therefore bring about a need for the oppressed group to decolonize the mind, as well as reclaiming sovereignty and self-recovery of culture, ending economic plunder and external political and cultural control in order to become fully liberated. To summarise, the Scottish people remain subject to features of oppression that run parallel with colonial rule. This includes external political control, plunder of economic resource, and domination by an alien culture and values. The reality is an Anglophone cultural hegemony and associated racial and ethnic hierarchy. It is these oppressions that give rise to an independence movement based on the solidarity of the oppressed ethnic group, the Scots. Economic exploitation and cultural domination have therefore combined to leave the Scottish people and nation diminished, underdeveloped, and in the process of perishing. Oppression is obscured via the cultural assimilation process and prevailing institutionalised colonial narrative. A colonised people are further subdued by the inevitable internalised racism accompanying a dominant racist ideology subordinating the indigenous ethnic group. And we should remember that colonialism always involves racism. And here today, we unveil the reality, therefore, that the Scottish people's inalienable and lawful right to self-determination and independence demands decolonisation, the ending of the scourge of colonialism, as a matter of urgency. Thank you.